Welcome to the episode 47 of Screw Being Unhappy podcast. I am Zuzana Mukumai, and today I am talking to Nikki Palazzo. Nikki was born and raised in Philadelphia in the US, immigrated to Germany, and currently lives in Asunción, Paraguay. 6 years ago, she decided to start a podcast in order to create a community for herself and others feeling similarly stressed but blessed in their life abroad. Her podcast is the ExpatCast, the show where expats share their stories about fitting in, standing out, and every mishap on their journey to find home abroad. When she's not podcasting, her favorite activities include reading and frolicking about in nature, be that via hiking, running, traveling, or taking a scenic nap. Hi, Nikki. I am so excited to have you and welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And I'm excited to see you after a while because we met actually on your podcast when I shared a bit about my life in Zambia. So I'm excited to learn today more about you, how you ended up in Germany, how you ended up in Paraguay, and because you have feet in different countries like me and most of my people who are listening, so I am sure you will agree that navigating life abroad and creating community for ourselves is an important puzzle piece for our happiness since we all have feet in different countries. So before we dive into the specifics, living in Germany and Paraguay, would you share a bit more about yourself and your story and which countries do you have your feet in?
Yeah, gladly. Yeah, so as you shared in the bio, I'm from the US originally, and I grew up in Philadelphia, or in a suburb of Philadelphia, but as one does when they live abroad, you just say the closest city. Um, and that's been a fun place to be from because people around the globe, a lot of people know it, but for very different reasons. So it's been fun discovering what we're famous for, where in the world. But I moved around the US a little bit as an adult. So I lived in South Carolina for a while, lived in Chicago for a while. Then I moved to Germany and I spent about 6 years in Germany in Freiburg in the Black Forest region in the southeast. So I was really close to the border with Switzerland, with France. And a little over a year ago, I moved to Asunción, Paraguay. And Paraguay is smack dab in the middle of South America. So it is not the one on the coast. That's Uruguay. That's what most people are thinking of when they hear Paraguay. But yeah, we're right in the middle next to Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina's just over the river. Yeah.
So what brought you to Germany and then to Paraguay?
Yeah, life is always how do you say, like a winding journey, right? So when I was living in South Carolina, I started dating someone who lived in Germany, and then that continued for the whole time I was in Chicago. And after a certain amount of long distance relationship where you're in different continents, at some point, it's good if you can close that distance a little. So after I finished my master's, I moved over to Germany to see if that way would work, if that would be a location where we could close the gap. And it did work out. The relationship didn't work out long term, but that's fine. I was really interested in living in Germany anyway, so it was kind of one of those moments where it just made sense to follow life in that direction. So um like all of my 20s were almost exactly split between the US and Germany. So my professional experience, my professional life has been very split between the two countries. And Paraguay is just a temporary stay. So while I was living in Germany, I met my now husband, and he's here for work for a couple of years. So we know we're here and we'll be here for a temporary stay, which is an entirely different experience than straight up just moving to a place. But yeah, going to stay maybe 4 to 6 years, something like that.
Okay, that's not that short as most of the expat people would move for 1 or 2 years. So that's pretty long, and perhaps we will get into this difference, moving somewhere for living in there and moving somewhere when you know that you are going to leave, because I experienced both and it's been very different experience. But before we dive into that, you mentioned before this episode, as we chatted, that moving in Germany, it really helped you to unlearn the toxic hustle culture in the US. And as somebody who comes from the Europe, just neighboring country from Germany, US is still very abstract and very exotic for me. I have never been, and what we see are the things we see on TV, right? So can you tell us a bit more about like what were the biggest differences between the US and Germany and how this change affected you?
Yeah, definitely. I think honestly, workplace culture is one of the biggest areas where I would say people in Germany did not understand the reality of what living in the US is. They have certain concepts of what the US means from whatever sources, but a lot of people didn't really realize that the US it's quite a intense work environment. A lot of people work, I mean, a lot of hours a week. I think a normal full-time job, if you're only working 40 hours a week, you're absolutely privileged. I would say 45 to 50 hours a week is more normal, but 50 to 60 is probably acceptable. I know people that work 80 to 100 hours a week. I know lots of people who work 2 to 3 jobs. And when you're at work, it's it's a whole world. Like it's pretty important to be there, to work hard. There's this expectation that you'll work hard and then raise up in the hierarchy, and you need to be getting raises and promotions every certain increment of time in order for this to be kind of correctly done within the culture. And I will say a lot of Americans hate that it is this way, but it also is this way because as wealthy of a nation as it is, those effects are not necessarily felt by the average person. So for me, I can say my experience, it was, I managed to graduate college a bit early, which was critical to my entire adult life because college in the US is so expensive. So university can put you in debt for like at least 50 grand, if not way more. So I was able to get in and out pretty quickly, start working a professional kind of normal job. But from there were multiple times in my adult life where I had to work 3 to 5 jobs at a time to keep myself in an apartment. So when I was living in Chicago, I was in grad school and well, it would fluctuate based on the season, but yeah, I worked between 3 and 5 jobs while going to school full time. And that was just necessary to not go even more into debt than I would have had to just to get that degree. So, when you grow up in those kind of environments, you understand a lot of pressures and a lot of what's necessary to survive and thrive. And I was someone, I always did really well in school. I got the best grades and I grew up understanding that part of my value is achieving these expectations put on me. And I did it. I was great at it. I was top of my class in grad school. I got, the internship that only one person per class gets. I got it. When I was leaving, I had job offers at one of the top libraries in the United States. I work as a librarian, by the way. That's my field. So I was offered a job at one of the top libraries in the US. I was offered another job at the American Library Association. So I had all these like amazing opportunities that were what my culture told me means I'm a good person, means I'm valuable to society. And instead, I left that, went to Germany, worked not even minimum wage. I worked a very low paying job for my transition year. And it was shocking to walk away from all that. I mean, I did it on purpose. I kind of I knew what life would look like if I kept going down that path. And it wouldn't be as stressful as what I had just gone through in grad school. But it's stressful to live in the US. There's a lot of pressures and a lot of financial insecurity. So long story short, I ended up in Germany. I learned German. I got a job at a German library. And all of a sudden, I have all of these protections. I think I was officially contracted for 39 hours of work a week. If I worked over that, it was logged. I got that in overtime vacation. I got 30 days of vacation automatically. The library, closed and shut its doors and people left in the evening, and you couldn't stay late. You couldn't work an insane amount. And there also wasn't quote unquote room for growth. Like, yeah, I could have changed positions here and there, but the pay structure is on a table based on how long you are there, not based on your performance. And all of these notions that I had from the US of like, okay, I have to learn to negotiate. I have to really prove myself and work my way up the ladder. All of that didn't even exist. I couldn't have done it if I wanted to. So this was really a crash course in letting all of that go and seeing what happens in my life when I shift those priorities. And we can get more into that, but I would say it was one of the hardest times of my life, to be honest.
And it sounds incredible for us, right? From somebody who comes from the 40-hour week culture, from the country where we have free university education up to our master degree, and just this crazy hustle culture. It sounds like from a movie to us. And I am wondering how people manage or don't manage to balance other areas of their life with work. What is your take on
I mean,
that?
it's really hard. I think one thing that is very different and important here is that Americans have a lot more fun wherever they are. So you don't have the concept of work hard, play hard, because you can't leave work. You're always there, or you're out at happy hour with your colleagues, or et cetera, et cetera. So I would say in the workplace, we had way more fun day to day. And, those people were my friends. They were my community. I looked forward to seeing them the way I would look forward to having a coffee with a friend anywhere else. So those lines get really blurred, and that can have a lot of benefits. And I've met some incredible people through working in those environments, and I've had some really amazing times. But it is also dark, if you leave that job, you leave an entire life. And of course, there are a lot of places that manipulate that. There are companies with ill intentions, and they can really manipulate their workers. So it goes both ways. But I think a lot of people, I mean, they're not like, it's difficult. They're not coping well. There's a lot of societal changes you can observe in the US because this way of living is like, it's really difficult. But there's a certain grittiness and like endurance to, I would say, the average American because of all this. So that can be a really good quality to have. But it's as always, it's a mixture of good and bad.
It's interesting, and thank you for sharing also the second perspective, because what we hear about usually is this hustle culture, but we don't hear about that the community that is created around the work that is different. Because I think for us it's like it's 5 p.m. let's go, this chapter of our life is closed, and we have completely different life outside of the work. So as you say, this can have some benefits to it, and seems like everything really have the good things and the bad things. Nikki, I'm curious, personally for you, what was most challenging moving from the US to Germany, and how did you deal with it?
I think that shift, that mindset shift was really difficult from this hustle culture to this more European mentality, because a lot of my self-worth was tied into that. And as said, I was doing what you're supposed to do. And so I was getting all this amazing feedback. And all of a sudden I land in Germany, and I didn't speak the language fluently when I got there. So, before I got my long-term job, I had an interview somewhere for a job where they said, you would be perfect, but your German's just not quite there. So we have another position that's available. Why don't you interview for that one? I interviewed for it, and they said, I mean, you have all the qualifications, but actually you're overqualified, and we don't want to put you in this position because you're going to be unhappy over time. So I was getting trapped in this, this tension between my education, my experience, my abilities, and my immigrant status, my not knowing the language status, my outsider status. And it was difficult to have all of that validation and that ease that I slid through life with. I mean, I worked hard, but a lot of opportunities came my way in the US, and all of a sudden none of that was there. The things I was offering didn't seem to be as impressive as I maybe thought they were. They weren't valued in the same way, and it wasn't an easy shift. But at the same time, I knew I want to let go of this. I don't want my self-worth to be based on raises and promotions and having impressive jobs. That isn't actually my value. That's just something I grew up in. So I don't know. It was a difficult time. I don't know how I got through it. I cried a lot. I had a lot of confusion and identity crisis moments. But I also tried to really focus on maximizing the opportunities that are possible when you're working in a 40-hour-a-week environment. And so I started developing hobbies, and I started my podcast during this time as well. And that was a huge way for me to channel some of my extra energy, because to be honest, it felt like some of my personality and also some of what I was bringing to a workplace wasn't quite desirable in my German work environment. And I wanted to respect that. I didn't want that to be a point of conflict. I thought, okay, fine. So I won't bring that energy here, but I'll create my podcast where I can be more, entrepreneurial and creative and connecting with people and doing all of these things that I have in me and I have this desire, if not need, to do. And I'm really glad I did, because I think that allowed me to have something that was really for myself, and my work was my work. And of course, I had feelings about the ups and the downs of my workplace, but it was so different than the sort of more existential connection I had with my workplace in the US.
And I was about to ask you, how did you manage to navigate this shift in untying your self-worth from the achievement and all the promotions and accolades? And you said, I don't know, but you mentioned that's how your podcast started. So I was wondering if probably, and correct me, I might be wrong, that the podcast was in a way for you to get the support and be surrounded by people who are going through similar things. But did you have also some other support? Because I also, when I moved abroad for the first time, which was probably 14 years ago, I can't even remember properly now, I never had any kind of support, and feels these days so much more support is available than it was some years back. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, that was another huge motivation for me to start the podcast. Yeah, for me, the podcast was always many things at once. So on one hand, it was my place to put my creativity and all that extra energy. But another aspect of it was just this resource sharing, because my first year in Germany, I worked at a German American cultural center in their library. So I sat at a desk and I met people from all over the States, all over Germany, and all over the world, who all spoke English and German. And so they could, we could find our way no matter where my level was. And they told me, I mean, anything from just nuts and bolts. How do you do this process? How do you move here? How do you make it work? What does this paperwork mean? What does it not mean? Should I panic? Should I not panic when this or that gets rejected from an agency, a government agency? I had so many people to bounce those things off of. And on top of that, they would tell me just about themselves and their lives and where things went differently than they thought, where they went better than they thought, where it went worse. So I could just feel how critical that was to my transition year. And I was mind blown thinking, how many people go through what I'm going through without sitting at that library desk and getting that level of support and community? So the podcast was also sort of for those people who maybe live in smaller villages or don't have the same type of work that I do. I think I'm also quite good at talking to people, so it was easy for me to fall into deeper conversations that meant so much when I was having a tough time. So I thought great. I can interview people on my podcast and we can have those conversations, and someone living in a village somewhere can listen and get some amount of what I was getting at that cultural center. So from the beginning, I would say my podcast had both aspects of it.
That's one of the reasons I love having my podcast as well, because having the conversations is so much fun and so much value. It has so much value in it, because I live in Zambia, in very far from other big towns, even if I live in a big town, and there is no way I would meet you in a real life, or people who I have on my podcast. So it's really great for me as well to talk to people, learn new stuff, but also share whatever we are experiencing with other people. And talking about life abroad and how we have to adjust. So living abroad really requires lots of flexibility and openness to pretty much anything. And I think if we are not flexible, we don't last very long living abroad. So how, and on the other hand, most of us, we need some kind of structure and routines in our life. So how did you manage to balance flexibility with structure, routine with the need to be spontaneous? How was it in your case, and what would you tell people who perhaps struggle to find a balance?
Yeah, that's huge for me. So now that I live in Paraguay, I work online. I work fully remote, asynchronous, it's like I have a certain amount of hours per week on average, but it could be less, it could be more, kind of based on what there is to do at the moment, what's going on in my life. It's an amazing amount of flexibility, and it's also totally overwhelming for me. So I've noticed I really naturally rely on a certain amount of structure. So I love having my routines, and I've just built them. I've decided that for myself, although nothing about my job demands that I work certain hours, I wake up at a certain time, I do a certain morning routine, I work pretty regular hours. I could be doing it at a different cafe every single day, but I don't, because it's just somehow it's a bit too wild for me. I'm just a creature of habit at the end of the day. And at the same time, I do crave spontaneity. I am a spontaneous person. I'm very creative. I hate being bored, and it doesn't happen much, but if I'm feeling too in routine, that's also a no for me. So I found different ways to make that, to just recognize it in myself, not really evaluate it, but just identify it and then work with it rather than against it. So for instance, if I have set appointments during the week that are during my quote unquote normal working hours, I take them. I make appointments then on purpose because I can afford to. I have a flexible job. But when spontaneous things come up outside of that, I really struggle with it. So I just try to keep that in mind when I'm making different plans or setting up appointments for like an electrician to come or whatever. And then I don't know, lately I started doing, like quote unquote happy hour at 3 o'clock every day. I just go make myself a nice juice because Paraguay has incredible fruit and incredible juices. So that can be a little spontaneous thing. Maybe I'll take a quick walk. And also I've declared Fridays as my spontaneous day. So some weeks that means I'm actually behind on work and I need to catch up. Some weeks that means I don't even sign into my actual job and I have time to do my own projects. Sometimes it just means I take the morning off and relax or do work around the house. So it means a lot of different things. But I found it's another lesson I learned through my podcast. I'm a very creative person, but sometimes I really do need that deadline. And having the podcast for as long as I did, it came out every week on Thursday without fail for 6 years, because once I set a deadline, I'm on it. And I really learned that about myself over these years. And at the beginning, I was like, that's so lame. Like, I wish it weren't that way. I wish I were more chill, because actually it wouldn't matter if I took tonight off and I put the podcast out a day later, no one would care. But something in me couldn't let it go. And so I stopped fighting that and just said it is that way. And I worked with it. And I recently ended my podcast, and I'm trying to free up some time for some other creative projects. And I'm really trying to bring those lessons in with me. So my other projects might not have the same release schedule or deadlines that a podcast does, but I can create them. And I'm really good at going with made up deadlines. So these are the ways that I try to kind of just recognize what are my personal patterns. Again, the hardest part is not evaluating them, not being like, I hate that I'm that way, or I wish it wasn't, just accepting it and finding creative ways to make it work for my current stage of life and what my life actually looks like at the moment.
That's perfect. And that's something I share often with my clients, that we really need to find what works for us in our particular situation at the given time, right? And I really like how you described that you felt it's boring, like to be able to publish a podcast episode every Thursday. But I believe most of the people are wishing they could be like that, because they are not like that, right? So we always want what we don't have, but it's really so important that we follow our inclinations, the ways like we are most productive, the way we function, and then play with it and create our happy hours at 3 p.m. or create our creativity days. I love those ideas. And usually this is, I believe, the most difficult thing for people who shift from regular job to business, or have that kind of step, you working in a location and then working remotely, is suddenly how to deal with this freedom. And that's, I think, where most of the people struggle. So how did that process looked for you?
You mean transitioning to a remote job?
Like figuring out what routine do you need, how to manage your day, how to structure it, because suddenly you had the freedom. You didn't have to be at one library from certain time to certain time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at first I was pretty excited about it. I mean, for me, this also coincided with a huge international move and all of the stress that comes with that. So I initially was just so glad to, I had a very public facing career, and that's a lot of pressure. You can't just be in a bad place and just turtle shell up. You have to kind of be on in a way. So I just tried to enjoy it for as long as I noticed I was enjoying it. And it's just that self-awareness. Like at some point I did start to turn into like a sloth and be like, okay, well, it's nice for a time. And then after, it's just a bit dangerous. So again, for me, I've been pretty lucky to just be a pretty naturally self-aware person. So I just noticed it and said, okay, then it's time to start reintroducing these structures into my life. And ever since I've reintroduced them, it's been so much easier. And life isn't routine. There's always something weird going on. So I don't think there's a single week where I actually do exactly what I think I'm going to do when I sit down Monday. Something always comes up, something always goes off path. So the spontaneous aspect, that takes care of itself.
You are very lucky having this tendency to be self-aware and noticing these things. And I just wanted to say that some of us are not that lucky, and it's one thing I often help my clients with as well, to notice these things. And I would say I feel it quite resonates what you are saying. So I think we might be on the same wave when it comes to creating our routines and needing the structure. And yeah, even if there is a long holidays and the structure goes out of the window, then I'm like, I need to bring that structure. So I usually give myself Sunday only to have a break from working out. And then here in Zambia, we are recording on Tuesday. So today and yesterday was national holiday. So it was 4 days off. So I thought like, no, Monday I'm working out no matter what, because I know it wouldn't work out very well for me. I would feel not that great. So yeah, it's really the listening to ourselves and paying attention to it, because also I think many people kind of know what is good for them but don't pay attention to it. So yeah, we are very lucky, but I just want to say that that's not the end of the world if somebody who is listening is not that lucky, because you can always get support with that. And Nikki, because my podcast, I really want people to be getting stuff done, and I want them to be productive and go into the action. What helps you to get stuff done?
Yeah, to be honest, I think it comes pretty naturally to me coming from, the city I'm from is a very working class city, and I come from this culture societally, like US wide, where people just work. So I think there's part of me that just like has that drive in me automatically, but not always. And there's definitely things that I put off and I don't have the energy for. So for me, that's where it's important to, again, check myself. I can get so stuck on getting a deadline done that doesn't really exist. I made it up and I'm putting so much pressure on myself for nothing. So first I stop and I check with myself and I'm like, is this just my weirdness coming out? Can I afford to not get this done actually and prioritize something else that will give me more energy and come back to that at a day where I feel more ready for that? If so, I'll do that. And if I can't, then I just try to trick myself. Like I really gamify my life a lot, even this silly 3 p.m. cocktail hour. Well, it's juice cocktails, it's not alcohol, but even that, or having a certain snack or sort of treat of some sort. The treat might be walking around the block. It might be going to pet my cat, and I'll say, I have to focus on this thing for 30 minutes and then I can go have a piece of chocolate, or I can go stretch for 5 minutes and just unwind, whatever it might be. So I, again, find it important to think about what are sort of rewards that work for me and that are healthy for me as a person. If I'm only ever, eating super unhealthy foods as a reward, like that's maybe also not good at the end of the day. So try to just look at it and see what are like healthy rewards that are going to nourish all parts of me, and then I add those in as needed.
Yeah. 100% agree. And it's funny, I love your 3 p.m. hour. And just recently, based on my coaching with my own coach, I started doing 5 p.m. tea with my son as well, to kind of unwind after the day and avoid immediately playing and running with him. So it's a good way how to make that transition. So it's really fun to include these fun stuffs in our lives that helps us to be more productive ultimately, because giving ourselves the energy, that's what we need to be more productive. And Nikki, I know we could probably talk on and on, but I know my people are also busy. I want them to be doing stuff, not spending hours and hours listening on podcasts. So if somebody's listening and they want to check out your podcast, or they want to get in touch with you, where can we find your podcast and where we can find you?
Yeah, so wherever you're listening to this, you can just go ahead and search for the ExpatCast. It's the podcast with the little bike logo. You'll see it, you'll recognize it. You can also find me on Instagram at the ExpatCast. And now that my podcast is coming to an end, all the episodes are still available. So there are, I don't even know how many, a couple hundred episodes you can go through still. But if you want to keep more up to date with me currently or connect with me today, you can find me on Instagram at Nikki Needs to Move. So it's Nikki Needs to Move. And that's where I'm sharing more about life in Paraguay, daily life, and lots of good travels as well.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Yeah, I'm sorry we didn't manage to talk more about Paraguay, but maybe for future podcast episode. And as you said, we can find you on Instagram sharing more about your life there. Thank you so much for being here. And it was really my pleasure chatting to you after, I think, 2 years.
Yeah, crazy. Well, likewise, it was so nice to see you. Thank you for inviting me on. And yeah, I'll be happy to come back and share more about Paraguay sometime.